Hi, I'm Meta Spencer, and today I have a great privilege of being able to have a conversation with some, I'd like to say old friends. I want to call Frank von Hippel an old friend, but I can't really make that same claim for the other three men who are joining us. The occasion, unfortunately, is a rather sad one, and that is the death of one of their old friends, Yevgeny Velikhov, who was, I think, one of the most important people in ending the Cold War. I would even include all of the men that you're going to meet today because they worked with Velikhov, and Velikhov was in a position to open doors to them so they could go places and do things and make contacts that they certainly wouldn't have been able to do otherwise, because they're all Americans and the Cold War was, very much on in those days. But Velikhov was a very peace-loving man and a very prestigious and knowledgeable scientist, and he had a lot of influence with all of the Secretary General, General Secretaries of the party, from Brezhnev through Andropov through Gorbachev. Oh, and there's Chernenko in there someplace, and then Yeltsin and even Putin. I have a photo of him with Putin. So he not only lived through a series of American presidencies and met people there, but he had very strong, powerful relationships in the Soviet Union. And he has just passed away at the age of 89, a wonderfully distinguished man that we owe a great debt of gratitude toward. And the same will, I want to say, for the four men here who are with me today: Frank von Hippel, Thomas Cochrane, Richard Garwin, and Roald Sagdayev. And all of them had close interactions in various ways, perhaps not all three at any one moment, but all of them certainly had good contacts with Velikhov and had important roles to play in ending the Cold War. So I could give a CV for each of you. You're all prestigious and very eminent scientists, and you all had a lot of influence in the ending, especially under the Gorbachev period. Sagdayev has, of course, as a Russian himself, a Soviet man of, I don't ever want to call you a Soviet man. I want to call you a friend, because you've been living in the United States for many decades now, I think, and and I'm also an American, a dual citizen of Canada and the U.S. And Sagdayev's relationship with Velikhov extends farther back than with other people here. And so I want you, if you will, Roel Sagdayev, if you'll tell us a bit about your early relationships with Yevgeny Velikhov.
It started in 1956. I just was recruited as a young researcher by Kurchatov Institute in Moscow, most highly classified institution in the Soviet Union at that time. The topic was controlled fusion, so peaceful uses of thermonuclear reactions. But everything was classified because the core people who were brought there, the older people, just came from Russian version of something like Manhattan Project. This is why everything was classified. We couldn't even pronounce the word plasma. Velikhov appeared almost immediately, but he was still student. 2 years more to go in Moscow University. But he was coming maybe once or twice a week. And one of my older colleagues gave him a work which eventually became a topic for his diploma work. Little, abstract problem of flow of conducting fluid through magnetic field, which was called magnetohydrodynamical situation. What kind of instability and so on, actually having no relations to fusion. So, but because he was a student, the problem was a little bit more abstract. But what happened many, many years ago, this is the very first paper which Velikhov published at the end of his Moscow University studies, became extremely important scientific point for understanding what's happening with the black holes. So called now its famous magnetorotational instability. Velikhov did in more or less abstract way, happens to work very well to make the matter, normal, regular matter, fall inside the black hole. Okay, so the interesting precursor to the future of Velikhov and mine, to some degree, involvement in all the nuclear issues, they're coming from this very place. Some of our mentors in that group, after spending years working for the bomb, were already thinking about what to do now in this terrible situation, how to save the world, in your terminology.
Mhm.
One of them was leader of Soviet controlled fusion program, Lev Artsimovich. I wonder, maybe Richard had a chance to meet him, because he was one of the first Russian scientists who was participating in newly founded Pagosh movement of that time.
Mhm.
I heard few stories when he would come back telling us what was happening at the meeting with Pagosh. I remember, vaguely that he even once mentioned name of Kissinger, who also apparently appeared at Pagosh maybe once or twice. Yeah.
Mhm.
So, but we still very far from that activity. We were publishing science papers, and one of the very first joint papers we published with Velikhov and another colleague of mine, Videnov, still now is quoted rather, actively on so-called quasi-linear theory of plasma turbulence, which plays some role in for fusion topics. So it struck me very well that Velikhov, being very bright in dealing with quite sophisticated mathematical problems, all these hydrodynamic instabilities, it's very special in that respect. But he had a very practical mind, thinking about devices and so on. Fusion was very far on horizon, still now, I believe. And Evgeny was interested with magnetohydrodynamic generators, how to convert the mechanical energy of the moving fluid into electricity, electric power. And he came up with a few suggestions, and bosses of institute agreed to establish a new additional department of institution, which quickly grew, and Velikhov became the director in a very young age. I think by the age 30, he was head of the division of institute with several hundred people working for him. So at that time, my regular daily contacts with him stopped. I moved to Novosibirsk, to newly created academic campus, Akademgorodok. But we were meeting often when I will visit back Moscow, maybe once or twice a month, and was watching what he was doing. it's interesting that part of his application of what he was doing, it's what kind of applied physics using magnetohydrodynamics, plasma, and other things, finally moved to be used to create new type of powerful lasers, which very of interest for military. And quickly, Velikhov got in contact with, hard military industrial complex people. I think it played a very important role, in my view, because he understands that something should be done. We should create our own forces, or counter force against that. Uh, Society spending so much money and attention to military industrial complex, which we knew very well that Eisenhower's concept is equally applied to Soviet reality about existence of military industrial complex. So early directorship brought him very soon to higher positions in hierarchy of Soviet Academy. He very early became, I think he was earlier than 40 years old, one of the vice presidents of Academy. And his responsibilities expanded from plasma, magnetohydrodynamic generators, fusion, to all the natural sciences, mostly. And
may I ask you one thing at this point? Because in my interview with him, he was recalling having had to fight hard to save the Academy of Science. And I'm not familiar with what's gone on lately. Is it still flourishing? Is it okay? Or nowadays, is it in danger again?
um, right now, I think Academy is in a very difficult situation, and he was absolutely right. His interview of 1997, which Frank distributed, says that he tried to do something, and he when he became vice president, very soon he got in conflict with someone who was appointed as a president a few years later, a mathematician, applied mathematician Marchuk. And by that time, Velikhov's activity extended already on contacts with international scientific community, even beyond talking about the danger of nuclear war. Yeah. Generation of Artsimovich, the early atomic bomb scientist, already were out of active life, and Yevgeny became a leader of that. He knew that it's very important to establish contact with the government, with the top people in the government, and he was elected as a member of Central Committee of the Communist Party, which gave him a chance to interact with a much bigger group of people. And his activity on nuclear danger issue became extremely important even before Gorbachev came to power. He traveled a lot and at Pagosh, and there were special meetings between several leading academies of sciences on that issue. He spoke about it in an interview with you, Mette. And Gorbachev, before he came to become general secretary, already was thinking what kind of younger people he should bring in his team. And Velikhov was invited to accompany Gorbachev to this very famous visit, first meeting of, first exposure of Gorbachev to the Western world, when he took invitation from Mrs. Thatcher. So obviously that was very important, and he started at that time to send messages to Politburo, to general secretaries, about current problems at that time. Before SDI, Star Wars came in 1983. We were talking about number of other issues like space weapons, anti-satellites, satellite issue. He was very active. And I remember he mentioned in this interview that General Secretary Chernenko, who was predecessor to Gorbachev for a very short time, maybe for 1 year, he even signed a letter to Carl Sagan and independently to Richard Garvin. Dick, do you remember this letter from Chernenko?
Yeah, I remember. And
So Velikhov obviously was instrumental in doing so.
And Andropov also, yeah.
Yes, and Andropov, of course, yeah. Yeah, and I think Andropov played a role in bringing Velikhov into different type of working groups collected by Politburo to discuss critical problems. Then there was this very important alternative channel of communication between two superpowers at the time when Soviet Union were under sanctions after invasion to Afghanistan, and Reagan inherited the same situation, and there were no serious discussions on critical issues related to nuclear weapons and so on for several years, besides this independent non-governmental channel. And Velikhov became head of this activity on Soviet side. He was the first, he was founder and the first chairman of Committee of Soviet Scientists Against Nuclear Danger. And now I think everyone knows, and Frank was interacting, Tom, and of course Dick had seen Velikhov number of times through meetings in that channel.
Now that's actually something I'd like to explore, because I think I know something about how Frank and Thomas were invited to actually do things like seismic monitoring during that moratorium. And so I know a little bit about the trips that, and I think sometimes you were together even when you went to the Soviet Union. But I'm not sure about Richard Garwin's role at that time. So Richard, can you explain what you were doing? And did it have anything to do with what these other two guys were doing?
I was the director of Space Research Institute as a major entity working for space science, and we had a very good contact. As a VP of Academy, was extremely helpful, was interested what my institute was doing, and I was invited.
Richard is eager to answer me.
I would like to speak, and I would like to introduce some names. And the names, first, I was involved in going to Moscow with SADS, the SADS, and Paul Doty was the head of SADS. And
sorry, what is SADS?
Well, somebody else will help me remember. And I used to deal with Kissinger. I used to talk with him in his office as Secretary of State and of National Security Advisor to the President before going to Moscow. And of course, I had to do with Velikhov, and Velikhov, who with his MHD activities, he had a rocket engine that each time he wanted to have a pulse, he had a rocket engine, and he would fire it up and get 20 megawatts of electrical power out of a intense magnetic field, and crossed with the velocity of the rocket jet. And I criticized that. That was my first involvement with Velikhov, was criticism of his use of the rocket. And I said he could do the same if with an automobile battery, ran, uh, changing its polarity over a period of 100 seconds or 200 seconds or 1,000 seconds, as long an integration as you wanted. And I think that Velikhov, when he this was in the context of the National Academy, which was the partner to the Soviet Academy of Sciences in the first. Uh, uh, Anyhow, we had to evaluate it after 10 years. And after 10 years, I decided it could be, I was head of the committee, it could be evaluated by having the individuals in the United States who had worked on the various programs of cooperation with the Soviets, by having them answer questions, but not to a questionnaire. We would have a person on a par with the individual in the United States, call him up or call her up, except in those days we didn't have many women involved. So
Probably still don't. I don't know.
we have a lot more, I can assure you. The head of the U.S. Academy of Sciences is a woman, has been for a good many years, and so then so SADS would meet in the presidium of the Soviet Academy, and elsewhere, and sometimes all the Russians would leave because it was their home city and they had things to do, and we would be left with the Americans talking to one another. But we were assured by Velikhov that not a word would be missed, even though there were no Russians present, by which we understood that there would be recordings, and I hope the recordings are good quality. And they had other recordings of American presence and embassies and so on in Moscow. And
Can you enlighten me a little bit about why they wanted you? I think was it because you had experienced yourself as a researcher in nuclear weapons in previous times, and they they wanted to compare notes, or what drew them to you in particular in those days?
Well, I was involved in everything because I was doing all kinds of things, ranging from national technical means of intelligence, both electronic and imagery, and all kinds of other things, including nuclear weapons. I was too young to be in World War II, but I have given a 40-minute lecture on Oppenheimer, even though I only knew him as head of the Institute for Advanced Study. I was in his house a couple of times in Princeton as a result, and sampled his martinis, and he brought down from his bedroom an Albrecht Dürer wood carving, which I held in my hands, a 500-year-old wood carving. Anyhow, so I've introduced most of these people. And of course, I knew people from graduate school, but I was only 17 years old at the end of World War II, when the bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
I was 14.
Pardon me?
I was 14.
Yes.
You and I both remember Hiroshima and Nagasaki very well, I'm afraid.
Yeah.
Right? I was 14 and you were 17.
Yeah, you're 3 years younger than I am. I'm 86 plus years old now. And one of the people I knew at Los Alamos, I was a summer consultant at Los Alamos from 1950 until 1965 or so. And and I shared an office with Enrico Fermi, who was my thesis supervisor at Chicago. I was already an instructor at Chicago, which was a higher rank than you might expect, and so I worked with Fermi, who taught me a lot about nuclear weapons and shock waves and things like that. And Marshall Rosenbluth, I want to introduce. He died, unfortunately, quite a while ago, but he mentioned Sagdayev to me, and we mentioned Sagdayev to Velikhov, and Marshall actually was a member of the group that met with Velikhov, who was not the first head of the organization that met with the Americans. It was an economics institute who was the first leader, but he died, and Velikhov replaced him, and that was, of course, much more interesting. And the fact that we had real scientists in Pugwash in those days was the important thing. And I hope that the rebirth of Pugwash after the first of the year will help. We have a woman from Argentina whom I've not met, but I hope to, and I'll be talking actually tomorrow with the head of the Pugwash Council, and so on. So that's as much as I want to say, but I'll answer questions. I can do that.
Well, maybe you can tell me how you were related to these other guys, these other Americans. Did you all know each other? Or I think Thomas and Frank worked together more, but did they have anything to do with what you were working on?
Well, I first got to know Frank von Hippel again at Los Alamos, but we were working on the 3 Mile Island. We were working on the model of deposition of radioactivity after a nuclear meltdown, and that was in connection with 3 Mile Island, and we were working on the wedge model that I think Frank introduced, and I was the senior person on that, and I was doing lots of things in those days. You can look at my calendar, and every hour of the day and night is scheduled with telephone calls. We used the telephone in those days, and eventually we had fax machines and made the fax machines interoperable. I began to work for IBM in December 1952.
Let me back up and touch on a couple of things that have been said. First of all, with respect to Dick Garwood, he's the only genius I ever knew. And he's, in my judgment, stands above all of us in terms of his intellect on these issues. And you always read everything you could get your hands on that Dick wrote or said, and listened to what he said. But he came, in my case, he came into these issues much before I did. I had the opportunity to first meet Velikhov in May of 1986 through a meeting that Frank had gotten Velikhov to put together in Moscow. And then Frank took the lead in deciding who was going to go on this trip, and who was going. We had discussions of who was going to pay for whom, and so forth. When I first met Velikhov in '86, one thing that struck me was he was into everything. I mean, he had about 40 projects going at once, including everything from nuclear fusion, nuclear weapons, arms control, to children's camps across the United States and Russia. And it occurred to me in my work with Frank and with Velikhov, one of the reasons we were successful is because it took three things on the Soviet side to make the projects work. It took a Gorbachev at the top, and he came in the head of the Communist Party in '85 and declared a moratorium on testing and so forth. But then you had to have a Velikhov who knew the issues and could get to Gorbachev. And Velikhov was also willing to take risks that probably other people in the Soviet Union were not willing to take in furthering his causes that he was behind. But Velikhov was so busy, you needed a third person under him that could make the trains move. And in the test ban verification work, in my judgment, that was primarily Mikhail Gockberg, who was the senior scientist at the Institute for Physics of the Earth. So it was a combination of those three individuals that enabled me, at least, and to get things accomplished through working with the Soviet side. Now,
Garwin just used the word SADS, and I didn't know what that was. Can you help me?
I think that was the Soviet American Disarmament Study Group or something like that. Is that right?
Yes, exactly. And SADS. And we had meetings with the Soviet scientists in the shadow of Pugwash. These were private meetings, but they were on a preceding day or the next day or two after the Pugwash International Pugwash meeting. So it was very important. And Paul Doty was the head of SADS for the Americans. It was only Soviet American disarmament studies. So just the two countries.
Thank you. Clarification.
What is Michelle's last name? Tom, Michelle.
Mikhail Gockberg.
Goldberg, he's still alive.
Yes, I email him every now and then, but not often, but he's still on.
Thank you.
He's still doing, I just got a few days ago a new song he wrote and singing his guitar.
Yes, he writes poetry and songs.
Wonderful. Okay, Thomas, can you tell me a little bit about what I remember you as extremely important in this thing about seismic verification? That was your main claim to fame, wasn't it?
Well, yes.
Not just. There was also the Black Sea experiment, I think.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well,
my interest started. I was in an environmental organization called Natural Resources Defense Council. When Reagan was elected, before he was elected, I'd been working on trying to stop curb the breeder reactor program in the United States, and the commercial use of plutonium as a nuclear fuel. And when Reagan came in, he started cranking up the U.S. nuclear weapons program, and I got interested in doing something in that area. And before I knew that no one was going to pay any attention to an environmentalist on an arms control issue, in those days, they would listen to people like Garwin and people in the Arms Control Association, but not an environmentalist. So I started by, with other colleagues, writing books about nuclear weapons. In that process, I read a paper that came out of Livermore Laboratory about how to muffle the sound of a underground nuclear explosion so you wouldn't be able to detect it with seismic instruments. And I realized that you didn't have to be on the test site to monitor such events. And I was thinking, well, wouldn't it be interesting to have non-government agencies monitoring the Nevada test site? And that idea, you wouldn't be able to get funding for that because it would be too one-sided and so forth. So I then thought about writing Gorbachev and Reagan both, sort of a joint letter for publicity purposes, to ask them if they would entertain having civilian scientists monitor the two weapons sites. A friend of mine who is a reporter at the Washington Star newspaper introduced me to a young man in the Soviet embassy, and we had lunch. The three of us had lunch together, and I pitched this idea to him. He later became the head of the UN ambassador from Moscow, Vitaly Churkin. And Churkin had some problems with my letter, had some recommendations that I didn't think would go anywhere. And so then I called up Jeremy Stone, who I knew and who Frank knew well, and asked him, how do you talk to these Soviets? And he said he would invite me to a conference in Virginia, which he did. And Frank was there, and I pitched my idea to the Soviet delegation, which was headed by Kokoshin, who all of us know. And I got kind of positive feedback. And so I started talking to Frank, and Frank says, well, I'm going to Moscow. I'll talk to Velikhov and see what we can do. And Frank got Velikhov to set up the meeting. And so then at that point, pitched the idea of NRDC, where I worked, would be willing to pay to field an American seismic team if the Soviets would jointly do this work, and we would monitor both test sites jointly.
Right. When you say we would pay, NRDC?
NRDC. And I took with me the head of NRDC's board of directors, Bill DeWin, who's now deceased, but fortunately he came along. He was the one that actually signed the agreement with Velikhov to do the work, although it's essentially my project. So we go to Moscow. There are 4 presentations. One of them is a theoretical presentation. The other 2, aside from the presentation I made, I say 4 presentations on the American side or the side, well, from Americans. And the other 2 would not go anywhere because they required Reagan approval. But my proposal didn't because it
Now,
was.
let me see if I can get clear about what's behind all this. This was not so much a matter of real discovery. Let me see if I'm right. It was mostly to change perceptions, wasn't it, about how likely it was that you could detect an explosion from a distance.
Maybe Tom, can I just,
Sure, Frank.
what the story, the prehistory on the test ban is that in 1963, in the wake of the Cuban Missile Crisis, Kennedy and Khrushchev got serious about negotiating a test ban. But because of questions that were raised by Teller and others, it turned out into a partial test ban treaty, and that was because the Soviets really were not comfortable with in-country seismic monitoring at the time, and then
But was the U.S.?
The U.S. was insisting on a lot of in-country seismic monitoring in the Soviet Union.
Well, there were a couple of problems. One was the joint effort on close-in monitoring, where you would have a separate well and you would put in a cable, and the shorting of the cable with time would give you an indication of the test. And so this is a close-in, but then there was also the teleseismic region, and that was done with waves that went down through the mantle of the Earth and through the core of the Earth and out the other side, so 7,000 kilometers away. And I was in the international meeting for 10 Nation. I was in two international meetings under the United Nations in Geneva at the same time, and one was for the monitoring nuclear explosions in outer space, and there I worked with Hans Bethe and people like that. And the problem was, suppose you detonated a nuclear weapon behind the moon, and you wouldn't see it on Earth, but you could have a satellite that was behind the moon. And the other one was the 10 Nation Disarmament Conference for Prevention of Surprise Attack, and we could never agree on the agenda. We agreed finally on the title of the conference. That was the extent of the agreement. So, but the teleseismic region, actually, I was not a member of that conference, but I was a kibitzer, and I was finally called to the table because I had used the CERN computer to a model of the seismometers. And the only thing that was specified in the two on the two sides were the peak amplitude, peak magnification of the seismometers, but not the frequency of the peak. But the peak had a gain of 1 million, and of course there were confusions about the translations of, and people had the waves reflected at national boundaries, but they aren't reflected at national boundaries. They're reflected at seismic discontinuities. But the important thing is that the the wave that goes up to the surface is reflected downward with a change of phase, and so the John Tukey at Princeton University fixed on that, and he looked at the Kepstrom, which is defined as the spectrum of the logarithm of the amplitude, and that is periodic. And so taking the spectrum of the logarithm of the amplitude of the reflected wave combined with the direct wave gives you an indication of depth of burial in the teleseismic region. And that I was the midwife of the fast Fourier transform in 1983 when Jim Cooley from IBM was recommended by the head of mathematics in IBM in response to my urging, well, more than urging, demands that IBM get together with John Tukey and program this. And Cooley did a wonderful job and made a Fortran program that changed the work factor required for this analysis from n squared, where n was the number of Fourier components, to n log n. And that's exactly the improvement that you get by introducing base 10 arithmetic. So it's as important in Fourier transform, which is used in all kinds of things, as base 10 arithmetic is. And it's exactly the same factor. Thank you.
Thank you.
So what I told you is that we didn't get a comprehensive test ban treaty in 1963 because of limitations on in-country monitoring. So what happened to open up this issue again in 1985, when Gorbachev came into office, a few months after he came into office, he announced a unilateral test moratorium. And but it was conditional on the Reagan administration joining by the end of the year. The Reagan administration didn't want to, and in fact even suggested, well, how do we really know that there's a Soviet moratorium? And this is where Velikhov comes in. We came in October 1985. We met at the centenary of Niels Bohr, and the theme was on openness, and which is Bohr had pushed very hard as necessary for nuclear disarmament. And Velikhov suggested that maybe they could allow and unilaterally allow an NGO to come in and monitor around the Soviet test site in Kazakhstan that they really had stopped. And this was that then led on to Tom's project, and their first seismogram from Kazakhstan was in July 1986.
Excuse me, but now I thought Tom had cooked up the idea first.
Well, Tom had been thinking about it, and
there are a lot of players and a lot of independent thinking and things going on.
But so these independently, you came up with the same notion.
Yes.
Okay.
And so when the first results came back from Tom's measurements or the seismologists, that team that he organized to do that work in Kazakhstan. It had a major impact on Congress, which had not been interested, which had lost interest in the test ban, because of the lack of in-country, the supposed obstacle of lack of in-country monitoring. And so Congress started actually pushing. This was a Democratic Congress with a Republican president, and two presidents in a row, Reagan and then George Bush Sr.
Let me interrupt you, Frank,
Yeah,
on that point.
okay.
Chris, when we brought the this was a very simple seismogram. It was more, it was not as good as the later seismic instrumentation put around the test site. But when we brought the seismogram back, Chris Payne organized a meeting of congressmen, a few congressmen who were, I would say, moderate, but were not on board yet. And when we explained what was going on in the Soviet Union with seismic monitoring and their willingness to allow us to go to the test site, it changed the position of the moderate Democrats. And that position was later adopted by Clinton. And Clinton got the test ban, but of course the Senate never ratified it. But there is a thread you can trace from efforts by Frank and others, and even people before Frank, to get a test ban. And then the workshop that Frank got Velikhov to put together. I go to the workshop. Velikhov agrees to do my proposal. I'm not a seismologist, so I turned to Charles Archambault, who was also there. And I said, Charles, you got to help me put together a seismic team. And he said he would. So he goes out, finds half a dozen seismologists that are willing to go to the Kazakhstan to do this first exploration in Kazakhstan. And interesting there, to get the equipment, there was 20 tons of seismic equipment we took to first to Moscow and then to Kazakhstan. You had to have an export license. So I was in an organization that had a lot of attorneys in it, and Jacob Scher, who was working with me, put together the paperwork. We had friends allies in the State Department, and in fact, DeWin knew the Undersecretary of State, Whitehead. So unlike a normal licensing, export license, they rushed this thing through, and we were able to get back to Moscow within a month, which is what Velikhov had asked us to get back, come right back. So one lesson from all of this is to change views. It really takes a coalition of people. Mm-hmm. And there was a wide coalition of people working on trying to get us to a comprehensive test ban treaty. And you look at what actually got us there. It may have happened if we hadn't have been around, but there were a few key events that kind of made it happen. And one was Frank's relationship with Velikhov, Velikhov's relationship with Gorbachev.
Yeah. Yeah,
Uh,
if I could intervene, I was during the Clinton administration, 8 years of the Clinton administration, I was head of the committee that advised the president nominally and also the Secretary of State. And it met 2 days every month. We had about 18 people and had all kinds of clearances so we opined on the test ban treaty and all kinds of things like that. And so, but in addition, I knew Velikhov from the Ettore Majorana International Center for Science and Culture in Erice, Sicily. And there is the Erice declaration, which has been superseded by another RSA declaration on control of biological weapons. But this was on control of nuclear weapons and banning nuclear tests. And I tried looking incompetently. I tried looking for that earlier declaration, which Nino Zakiki, Antonino Zakiki, with whom I worked on G-2 for the Mumeson in 1959 to 60 for a whole year then, and going back to Geneva to CERN over the several years it took to finish the experiment and processing the data in my computers at IBM. Anyhow, so I wanted to introduce Erice, which was a very important, very important place, and Nino Zakiki also.
Thank you.
Could I suggest? I mean, CTBT was one important thing, but it was not the only important thing, and the Star Wars and the deep cuts that finally that really were launched at the end of the Gorbachev period, I think are at least equally important and deserve a little airtime.
Mhm.
And maybe I'll just start on that. I think Dick can correct me, but I think our first engagement, my first engagement with Velikhov was following the Reagan's Star Wars speech in March 1981.
63.
Pardon? 83.
83.
Yeah, yes, I'm sorry, 83.
Because I was receiving an award in California that day, and my wife and I were in a hotel, and I was putting on my formal clothes and listened to Reagan's Star Wars speech. He asked that the physicists who had given us nuclear weapons would give us the means to render them impotent and obsolete, and by means that were non-nuclear. And he didn't tell his Defense Department that they had to be non-nuclear means. And so, in fact, they had nuclear-powered lasers and fast reaction rockets to launch the lasers above the atmosphere and rapidly enough to get the rockets in boost phase that were threatening the United States. Anyhow, over.
Yeah, so in response to Reagan's speech, a group of Soviet academicians led by Velikhov and Sagdiyev, I think, wrote an open letter and said, well, we had these discussions before the 1972 ballistic missile treaty, which limited ballistic missile defense for a couple of reasons. One, it seemed the offense would always dominate over the defense, and secondly, trying would create an offense-defense arms race. And they said, have you? And they asked us, have you changed your mind? The Western scientists. And Jeremy Stone and I responded. I was the chairman of the Federation of American Scientists at the time. Jeremy was the president, the full-time president. And we responded, no, we haven't changed our mind, and we'd be happy to come to Moscow to discuss with you. And so over Thanksgiving in 1983, we went to Moscow and met Velikhov and Sagdayev and Kokoshin and Kapitsa, the leadership of this group that Velikhov had set up, the Committee of Soviet Scientists for Peace and Against the Nuclear Threat. And I think already before then, they'd actually started with another name to engage with the National Academy of Sciences Committee on International Security and Arms Control, that Dick was part of, and so that was the beginning, and so then this discussion and Gorbachev wanted to have nuclear disarmament, and there was, but this ballistic missile defense was in the way. Because the thought was that, well, if the offense decreases to a certain degree, maybe defense will become possible, or become more possible anyway. And so and Roald can really pick up here, but I think they ultimately convinced Gorbachev that, in fact, it was nonsense. But it took a while. And the Reykjavik, and Dick was part of that discussion with Velikhov and Sagdayev and et al. Dick was a leading critic of Star Wars in the U.S.
Yeah, well, we had. I have recordings of presentations, TV recordings of presentation with Hans Bethe and Carl Sagan and so on. But CSAC was formed as a direct successor to SADS, with Paul Doty also as a founder of CSAC. And the CSAC, the Committee on International Security and Arms Control, met with the purpose of meeting with the Soviet scientists, and we saw Roald and Velikhov in Washington once or twice a year, typically, and that was founded in 1980 as a direct successor of SADS. The American Academy of Arts and Sciences could no longer support SADS, but we had an angel who would support CSAC, and that worked very well. And then that was in 1980. Gorbachev came in 1985, and people said, he's not serious. He won't last very long. He'll die young, like Chernenko and Andropov and so on. But when I went to Moscow for my first meeting, and I saw there was no longer brandy on the tables, official tables, and so I said, he's serious. He's made these changes, and
you remember, Dick, that Gorbachev was joking that he is not so much general secretary, but mineral secretary, mineral water.
Right. Thank you.
Yeah. So,
Okay, are you through with that story? But I want, if you're through, I want to hear about the Black Sea activities, because I thought everything I knew about that sounded very adventurous. Anyway,
Well, I didn't think that. I think Velikhov had the idea that you could detect remotely the uh, the emissions from the nuclear weapons in their launch tubes, and that was the question whether you could or not. And you could detect neutrinos if you had enormous detectors. They would be enormous, but we didn't see any way you could have remote detection of the of the charged particles or the neutrons or whatever. And I don't know, Frank, what you have.
what happened was that Roald came to me and said Velikhov had made a mistake in accepting this claim, and that we had to clean this up. And so we actually started a joint project on the detection of warheads, and we wrote a book that Roald and I edited, but then Tom picked up on this.
Well, I was at some of these early joint meetings that you had arranged with Roll, and I was aware that of Velikhov's era, and then back to the seismic work, after we finally got U.S. government to allow the Russian seismologists to come to the United States, we took a delegation to Nevada to witness the sensitivity of the instrumentation that had been installed around the Nevada test site.
Sorry, were you there for a test or not?
No,
They weren't tested.
Previously, the after we did the initial instrumentation in July of '86, the real professional seismologists, including a team from Scripps Institution of Oceanography led by Jonathan Berger, set up very sensitive instruments around the test site in Kazakhstan and around the Nevada test site. We went out and took a congressional delegation in, I believe it was '87, to look at these new installations they were putting in. And while we were there, the Velikhov had arranged for them to set off a 20-ton chemical explosion at the Kazakhstan test site. And that was used to show the sensitivity of the instruments, which were about 100 kilometers away. Mm-hmm. Now, we duplicated that 2 years or 3 years later around Nevada. And John Berger arranged to set off a chemical explosion to demonstrate the sensitivity of the instruments around it.
Let me back up. I just want to know, when Dick Garwin a minute ago was talking about, the formulas for how you calculate these, that's what he was talking about, right? How you would measure how far down and that kind of thing. Those calculations were relevant to those experiments in Nevada and Kazakhstan.
Well, the significance of the 20 tons is that it's 0.1% of the 20 kilotons. of the yield of a normal atomic bomb. And so it could be the residue from a decoupled atomic bomb. So one that's fired in a vacuum in this a large sphere, a very large sphere that's evacuated, and it's nevertheless there's some residue, and it could be 0.1% or 1% of the undecoupled yield. So you know about such things, Frank, right?
Well, getting back to the Black Sea, Velikhov came to Nevada to be party to these demonstrations of the instruments around the Nevada test site. And we were flying back, and Velikhov and I were sitting together on the plane and having a conversation. Well, what are we going to do next? And I was, of course, aware of the work that Frank and Raul were doing because I had a bit part in that effort. And so I suggested to Velikhov that, well, why don't we do some experiments to test the sensitivity of radiation detectors to detect the presence or absence of nuclear weapons on ships, because at that time there was a effort to eliminate tactical nuclear weapons, and one of the problems was nuclear weapons on surface ships and the difficulty in detecting whether they were actually on the ships or not on the ships.
Well,
So Velikhov agreed to do the experiment, and so over the next year, I spent a year assembling a team and finding the right radiation detectors to take with us. And Velikhov assembled 6 teams on the Soviet side, and they invited us to Yalta to do these experiments. So we had actually, when we got to the Yalta, we were housed on a hospital ship in the harbor. The ship with the nuclear weapons was the Slava, which was the main ship of the Black Sea Fleet, and it was out a ways. But we had discussions on the hospital ship with press people present, and there's some of the leaders of the Soviet arms control negotiations, like Karpov, were there, and mentioned that the Soviets would be willing to take the warheads off the surface ships even without the verification if the U.S. would go along. But we did the experiments, and following it, we had a congressional delegation along with us, and following the experiments, Velikhov took us to a couple of interesting sites. Frank was along to disprove the DOD's claim that the Soviets had this advanced laser defense system at Sarashegan. But moving forward a bit, I came back and met General Powell, told him that the Soviets were ready to take the warheads off the ships if the U.S. would without verification. He said, no, we can't do that. He wrote me a note and gave 3 reasons why the U.S. wouldn't do that. And then, of course, 2 years later, George Herbert Walker Bush and President Yeltsin agreed to take the warheads off the ships without verification, which was fortunate because it meant that the warheads were taken off the Slava, which had been renamed the Moskva, the flagship of the Black Sea Fleet, and that was sunk by the Ukrainians, and it didn't have nuclear warheads on it.
Uh-huh. Yeah. In fact, you can confidently detect in a 3,000 ton or a 10,000 ton ship, you can detect the hole in the water that the ship makes. You can confidently detect that by radiation detectors, but that has nothing to do with detecting a nuclear warhead.
That's right.
Well, the context, just to clarify a little bit, was that that the Soviets wanted to include a ban on sea-launched cruise missiles, nuclear-armed sea-launched cruise missiles, in the START Treaty.
It was special request from Gorbachev. He tried to ask all of us to do something to support this demand.
I'm sorry, I misunderstood. I thought you said a man on the cruise missile. What did you say?
A ban on nuclear,
Man, oh,
on nuclear-armed
I
cruise
had this
missiles.
image of a man floating around on a cruise missile.
And when Gorbachev was talking to Reagan about this thing, he would get answer, no, it's impossible because we cannot agree on something which could not be verified.
Mm.
Right.
And we're already talking. So one of the scientists in academy, he was the director of Institute of Geochemistry, came to Velikhov and said, oh, we have a solution to this problem. We can detect whether there are nuclear warheads on a submarine 100 miles away. So, and Velikhov said, okay, what is your idea? The idea was following. You have a small amount of neutral gas, the noble gas, argon, in the atmosphere. And one particular isotope, argon-40, has an interesting ability. He can pick up the hard radiation, gamma ray quantum, and go into excited state. It's a nuclear physics call it isomeric state, and get it out to inform of some decay only hours later. So they said, look, that means that submarine which would send these gamma rays as a byproduct of presence of nuclear warheads already could move to such a big distance, and we can then calculate and deduce where the position of submarine was. And then I said we have to do some job, calculate a noise effect, statistical probability that you can make some reasonable deduction from this data. Velikhov said, I agree with you, but you know, I was so excited, and unfortunately, I already told Gorbachev that it would solve the whole issue of arms control universal. So it was about 2 months prior to summit in Washington, D.C. in December, end of November, early December of 87. And then we had in a larger circle, including Arbatov, Georgy Arbatov, remember, another advisor, advising to Velikhov, you know, you should go and tell Gorbachev that we found a mistake. I think what happened, nature of Velikhov was extremely positive, optimistic man, very receptive to different ideas, and, you know, with good wishes. He took it and he wanted to help, you know, to the guy who invented and to help to Gorbachev. So this is what happened. And it was too short time to actually to get to Gorbachev and so on. At that time, the government bureaucracy, the Central Committee bureaucracy, already issued instructions to make a big national program of the major tests, invite Americans, and this is how Tom finally became. It was very difficult. I was present at one of the sessions discussing what scientists should react. People like Hariton, you remember Hariton, head of the nuclear bomb science, he came. Alexandrov, who was the director of Kurchatov, in addition to presidents in academy, sent his deputy academician Spartak Belyaev, so several people. And Avrorin was there from Chelyabinsk 70. And we signed a letter to Gorbachev that this idea wouldn't work. And some of the hard, core bureaucrats, red tapes, helped to hide this letter from Gorbachev.
Yeah.
Wait a minute. You mean they did not want it known that this was a mistake?
Because
they wanted to go ahead and claim it?
Yeah, because probably someone of them, maybe that scientist who came with the idea first said, why Hariton is afraid of this type of experiment? It would demonstrate that Soviet-made warheads are very dirty radioactively and much easier to be detected by Americans and vice versa. So that was the case.
Well,
okay, I want to know the outcome. Exactly. There was just one event when it really was demonstrated. You flew over with somebody flew over with a helicopter and a detector of some kind.
Yeah,
you flew over a Russian ship, right?
You can do it's helicopter detectors were already routinely done by Soviet military, American military. For example, if you have a military ship somewhere in Mediterranean, the Soviet military helicopters often, very overflying at the altitude of few tens of meters, 20, 30. And they were getting this signal because it's short distance. Nobody was objecting that you can detect at this distance.
And was this an American helicopter?
Was mutual. It was very kind of friendly overflying from over Russian ships and vice versa.
Let me say, at the Black Sea, the American delegation brought one detector that worked and which was a germanium detector that you had to be right on top of the warhead to see it.
Yeah.
The Soviet side brought, I think, if my memory serves me, 6 experiments. One of which was led by the gentleman, I think it was Velikhov, the head of the institute that told Velikhov the false information that he had.
The wrong idea, yes.
He brought his system.
Yeah.
And it failed.
Yeah.
But of the other several systems that the Soviets brought, one was a helicopter full of tritium, I guess, that was used to detect neutrons from plutonium in the warhead.
Helium-3, Tom.
Helium-3, excuse me. Yeah, and so that experiment worked well, and we later were briefed about that helicopter system when we got back to Moscow. We went to the Kurchatov Institute, and they told us more about that system, including showed us photographs of American ships and sailors on the American ships that they overflew. But that system would only detect warheads with plutonium in them, which would be most of them, but not all of them necessarily. And it had a range of about 70 to 100 meters. So you have to fly close to the ship. They claimed that they could count warheads on the surface of some ships within one or two, but I don't think they could detect warheads in the bottom of aircraft carriers that would be loaded on aircraft and so forth. But if you had an American system that had the warheads like a nuclear tipped torpedo mounted on the surface of the ship, it could see it. But that was a far cry from the original problem, which was the claim that you could see warheads a mile away and so forth.
But I
It
think
was
the final
proven first.
was worth of doing it. Science, there was no sensation in science, nothing, no miracles, but it helped to the rest of the world, to American side also, to see how Soviets could be open in this area.
Yeah.
So that paid off after, I think.
And then after the experiment, Velikhov took the American delegation first to Sarashegan to see the laser system that was under development and proved to be far less capable than what the Department of Defense was advertising, the U.S. Department of Defense. And then they took us to Kistim, Chelyabinsk 65, later Kistim, whatever, where the Soviets first produced the plutonium. It's equivalent to our Hanford, where they first produced plutonium for their warheads. And we toured some of the production reactors that had been shut down. And it was Velikhov, throughout the period that Frank and I were interacting with him, was using us to help Gorbachev in his glasnost efforts, opening up formerly secret facilities. So we would bring a team over, and sometimes, a couple of times, three congressmen would come along and their staff. And then he would take us out to these secret installations. The first of which was to go visit the Krasnoyarsk radar site, where there was an early warning radar under construction. And it was located in a place that violated the treaty on
ABM treaty.
the ABM treaty. And the United States government was claiming this was, since it was not located on the edge of the country required under the treaty, it was a battlefield management radar system. So we were in Moscow with this first congressional delegation that went out to look at the seismic sites that were being installed in Kazakhstan. We flew back to Moscow, get into Moscow around 6 o'clock in the evening, and Velikhov calls me up and says, "Get your delegation together. We're going to Siberia at midnight." And so we get on a plane and fly to Siberia, and then get on helicopter and fly to the Krasnoyarsk radar site. And
Krasnoyarsk was way out there.
it was, yes, but it was near it was not that far away from some ICBM sites. but it had nothing to do with battle management.
Yeah.
And we were able to show that because reluctantly, but we asked to go into the buildings, and they gave us permission to go in for a few minutes. And we went into the receiver building, and you could see where the radar receivers were located and how they were spaced. And the spacing of the receivers is related to the wavelength of the radar. And so you knew the frequency of the
Oh,
signals, and the frequency was so low that it couldn't have been a battle management radar. So it was proof that it was not battle management. And eventually Soviets took down the Krasnoyarsk radar station.
But before they decided to put it down, military industrial guys advised Gorbachev to come up with an intermediate proposal. Okay, we agree that we violated the rules, but now we Soviets provide this instrument as a scientific instrument for international cooperation, non-military. So, and they wanted Velikhov to be a salesman for the idea which everyone in the world would understand is just,
did he
stupid.
go with it?
Yeah.
Did Velikhov promote it?
Of course, he knew, and he explained Gorbachev, and finally decision was just to dismantle it without it.
Mhm.
But all the episodes we were discussing now, you can understand what kind of reputation Velikhov developed for himself among these military industrial guys. And it culminated in 1989, in the spring, when Gorbachev assembled first session of Congress of People's Deputies. It's a new type of parliament instead of Supreme Soviet, much more democratic. And it started. I remember Yevgeny told me privately, he said, Rold, I need also your advice. Gorbachev asked me if I would agree to assume the role of chairman of the Committee on Arms Services, just like American Sam Nunn at that time. So, and we had a conversation and agreed that if he would assume this role, he would have to change his life. He's not anymore scientist. He would be just statesman, And but Velikhov, how much he wanted to do this reform, military, everything, and he agreed. And then sessions started 1 day, second, 1 week, and this committee started to form. People were talking who would be becoming chairmen and so on. And Velikhov comes to me in the midst of the session and said, Rold, I do not hear any follow-on, after first Gorbachev proposal. Can you do some kind of, tacit investigation? What's going on? I went to Primakov, you know this name. He was a very good friend of mine since university time. And I said to Evgeny, he was also Evgeny, do you know what's happening? Is Velikhov going to be chairman? And he said, oh no, it's a complete change. His name is already cancelled. Gorbachev told nothing to Velikhov, and military industrialists got their own man as the chairman of this committee. So I think it was in an interview which Velikhov gave to you, Mette, you feel this type of sad frustration.
He said he didn't feel that he could accomplish anything in those years. Well, we're now close to, we've spent most of 2 hours, And I'd like to finish off by a change of pace because, you know, the relations now, East-West relations, are just as bad as they were before you started your efforts. And we're in a very bad space. Tell me, what have you learned that you could pass on to the people who are trying to solve this terrible conflict, or it's close to a conflict anyway now, can between East and West? What advice do you give? Have you learned something that you can pass on to people who are trying to make some progress by solving the problem and that you have so successfully addressed?
Well, my first piece of advice would be get involved, but understand if you're trying to make major social change, it will take at least a decade. And in the end, you may not be successful, but you should get involved anyway. My second piece of advice is that demonstrations are very useful in this process. And I go back to the Black Sea and the seismic demonstration. You can write technical papers, you can write policy papers. A lot of people, politicians, don't read them. Those that read them have their own views and they don't pay any attention to what you say. But if you do a demonstration like we were able to do at Black Sea and in Kazakhstan, you can get world attention. You can get on the front page of the New York Times. You can get your issue out front. And I think Velikhov understood that. And then the third thing is, if you want to create social change, it just takes a coalition. And you need to, if there's not one, you have to invent it. And
well, is there anybody in Moscow now that you'd like to coalition with?
I think you have to sit back. I don't think there's anybody in Moscow to do business with right now, and it's because of Putin. And remember earlier I said the reason we were successful is there were three people. There was a Gorbachev, there was a Velikhov, there was a Gartberg. Today we don't have the Gorbachev. So we may have to wait till Putin's out of the picture. But that doesn't mean you can't do things in the meantime, but success may take a long time. The same is true in China. We used to have very good relations with the Chinese weapons program. We don't have that anymore. I don't think we have that anymore. I'm not involved. But, you know, you've got a leadership now that's very different from what it was in the 90s.
Well, let's see if everybody agrees with you. Does anybody have any qualifications with what Thomas has said? Or do you have some additions to make?
I guess I would add sort of at a slightly more abstract level. I think Niels Bohr, his big message to the UN was, and in fact, even during World War II, when our nuclear weapons program was figured, his message to both Roosevelt and Churchill is, you've got to be open with Stalin about what you're doing. Stalin knew anyway because of spies in Los Alamos. But you've got to be open, or we're going to have about this, and also share the decision about the use of this nuclear weapon, or you're going to have an arms race, nuclear arms race with the Soviet Union afterwards. And Bohr continued with this publicly this message to the UN after a couple of open letters to the UN Secretary General about openness, and I don't know whether there was any cause or effect, but Gorbachev and Velikhov and Sagdiyev all understood the importance of openness in trying to end the nuclear arms race, and they did end the nuclear arms race. We didn't get to zero nuclear weapons, but they did end the nuclear arms race. There's signs of it now reviving. In the U.S. and China has been building up. But this idea of openness, which Tom and Velikhov were geniuses of, and it was also, by the way, the audience, I think, and Roald will be able to say better. The audience, they were playing to an audience within the Soviet Union in trying to, because Gorbachev was not unopposed in his nuclear disarmament initiatives, and they were trying to explain that that the rest of the world actually supported, or some important parts of the rest of the world supported what Gorbachev was trying to do. And in fact, I think one reason I was so involved was I was the chairman of the Federation of American Scientists, and that seemed much more important than it actually was. It was an NGO, but I think they were playing off of that. That maybe there was a federation of all American scientists, and they all supported what Gorbachev was trying to do. I do think that there's lessons to be learned from this. And I just wanted to get back briefly to Velikhov, because this is about Velikhov. When things started going bad toward the end of Gorbachev's period, and Roald understands this much better than I, Gorbachev started siding with the hardliners more than Velikhov and Gorbachev were happy with. I mean, the Velikhov and Sagdiyev were happy with. I talked to Velikhov about this, and he said, "You shouldn't fall dead before you're shot."
You shouldn't what? Say it again.
You shouldn't fall dead before you're shot. And he sort of hung in with trying his agenda to the very end. And in fact, yeah.
Yeah, I would add also there, if I were younger and wanted to do something in this area, I would try to get into organizations like Pugwash, like FAS. Pugwash in particular offers an opportunity to meet with people around the world. And you think back, Pugwash was started after World War II. It didn't immediately end the Cold War, but it was an important element in keeping that debate alive and keeping the issues out front.
Well, it wasn't really World War II. It was Russell Einstein, the Manifesto, and then a Cleveland industrialist had a mansion in Pugwash, and he had the Pugwash conference there, the first Pugwash conference, which I think had about 20 people, including women and Chinese and so on. And contact among individuals is very important. For instance, Roald had some IBM computers, and I worked for IBM, and Roald told me that if I would open the back door and read the serial numbers of the computers, it would help him a lot, because they were legitimately acquired, not from IBM, but from the person, the people to whom IBM had sold or rented them. They sold them legitimately to Iki, and so I did that, and it never was heard from again. I sent it to Washington, or they sent it to Washington as well, and
Thank you.
mission accomplished.
What went wrong? Why we did not be so successful now with at the Putin era?
Mhm.
This is. I was thinking about it. I'm sure Velikhov, Evgeny probably was thinking about it until the very last second he was alive, and. Tom was saying important things, that we kind of we very not active in the same ways as we were in last 20 years of 20th century. And it's not only Gorbachev. I can go to what was happening before Gorbachev. ABM Treaty was signed in 1972. Yes, 72. Long
Right.
before Velikhov became important and involved and so on. And going back to the history of how Soviets agreed to sign, ABM Treaty, the whole concept to limit the defensive activities, anti-missile activities, came from American side. And I think Dick, I'm sure Dick was involved from the very beginning in the debates, and it originated inside the scientific community in America. And it was picked up by Johnson administration and McNamara. And when they delivered the idea that there should be something like a treaty limiting anti-ballistic missiles activity, first reaction of Soviet government was very negative. It's famous quotation from Prime Minister Kosygin, who was visiting United States and meeting with President Johnson. He said, "Oh, defense is moral, offense is immoral."
Mhm.
And it took, about 3-4 years to Soviet government to accept this idea. And I would like to know more how this was cooking of this issue in the United States was going on. But I'm sure it was a role of people involved, all of this group of great American scientists who were very active. And I agree with Tom when he said that we have a real genius in Richard. I would add, not only genius, he is institution by single man institution in every way. It's such a unique case. So we need something like that, presence of these people, their activity here. And what we need from governments, from the top people, even we had something from Politburo before Gorbachev came, when we had patient discussions in Geneva for several decades. I remember Arbatov, George, tells me something strange is happening. American delegation is trying to erect new buildings, new cottages for presence in Geneva. He said, that means that they are not counting on quick resolution of the problem, but for very long negotiations. I think exactly what we need. We need to involve in these infinite negotiations. If, for example, if Joe Biden getting ultimatum from Putin a month or two before Russian invasion in Ukraine, instead of smiling and saying this is stupid, would say, okay, let's talk about your worries. Let's go back to Geneva, send people, start talking. This type of patience needed for political leaders on top. And now I would like to come back to ABM Treaty. Why we do not have it anymore? George W. Bush said he was the initiator of killing it. And famous quotation from him was, "Friends do not need treaties."
Yeah.
So what was behind this conversation, nobody's felt, nobody asked. So why do we need treaty organizations if we are friends?
Yeah.
And this moving this treaty organization, NATO, closer to Putin, who is a monster. We have the only thing about everyone in the world, including even Indians and Chinese, agree is that Putin is a monster. But we have to find a way to deal with the monsters, not to lead to the brink of the world, nuclear world war.
Yes, we haven't even discussed Velikhov and Chernobyl. In April 1986, in Ukraine, the fourth reactor at Chernobyl melted down. The others are still operating, or were still operating until they were shut down preemptively and are in standby mode. And Velikhov played a heroic role in going on a helicopter, dropping lead in the open reactor, which was no longer operating, but it was exposed to all of the stored radioactivity. And he did many other things. He for instance, he connected one of his rocket engines around the shelf, the Nordic countries, so that he could go from the Baltic Sea and the seawater around to the other electrode on land and or in water, and therefore you would have a very large dipole moment, and you could sound the Earth resistivity down to tens and hundreds of kilometers, and it could be done better, of course, by fast Fourier transform, but that's another story. Thank you.
This has been so interesting. I'm afraid we're going to have to end it. I would love to just keep going hours and hours and hours, but I'm sure that there are lots and lots of people who want to see this and listen to what you've shared with us. I'm immensely grateful to all of you, and I've had a good time, and I hope you have too.
Thank you for bringing us together. It was wonderful.
Well, it has been an enormous privilege and a pleasure. So thank you very, very much. I'll send you the links, and please distribute it to your friends or anybody that you want. It's been such a treat. Okay.
Netta, may I say one simple sentence?
Sure.
It's nice to meet you, Netta. Good to see you, friends.
I'm sorry, Roald. I didn't hear what you said. Roald?
Yeah.
Say it again, Ro.
Yeah, say it again, whatever you said.
I don't know yet. I'm waiting for the news. I'm sure it would be a shame if they would not find a place in Novodevichy.
Yeah. All right. Thank you so much, and all good wishes to everybody. Okay.
Pleasure meeting you.
Bye.
Thank you.